In this video, we're going to make a honey dipper on the wood lathe. I've been making honey dippers for many years, and it's a great item that I sell at farmers markets and craft shows, and I even give them away as wedding gifts. I made a YouTube video a while back where I make a honey dipper in under 5 minutes, but I make them a little bit differently now, and this video is about why I do that. If you get anything out of this video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. And if you want more wood turning videos, I want to sincerely ask you to subscribe and help support me. I'm Jason Geiser, and this is Geiserwoodturner. Let's revisit the honey dipper.
As we get started, I'm going to start out with this maple blank, and it's about 1 inch by 1 inch by about 8 inches long. And we'll go ahead and mark the centers on this to get the most use of the wood. And I almost exclusively use maple. And I used Eastern hard maple because it's a really consistent wood and it has a hard time chipping. So don't get a lot of tear out and things like that when I'm making this. And that makes a big difference because you're working with some really small beads on the end of your honey dipper. Okay. Now that that's marked on all 4 corners, it makes a little square in the middle that I can place my center point. Now 1 inch is my starting point for the diameter. If you want something a little bit bigger, you can always go to something like 1 1/4. It'll give you a little bit bigger honey dipper. I used to make this with a 7-inch blank, and I've gone with the 8-inch blank because my customers wanted something that was just a little bit longer, something that you could put down into like a mason jar full of honey. And so I'm making it a little bit longer to accommodate that, and I like the look of it as well. When we're all done with it, this honey dipper should be somewhere around the 7 1/4 inch range, and that should be long enough for what we need. Now that we have our blank between centers, we can go ahead and turn the lathe on and rough it to round. And I'll use my spindle roughing gouge for this, and the RPM is somewhere around 2200 to 2500. You can go fast for this because it's a small diameter piece. We'll go ahead and get that set, and I'll turn the speed up just a little bit here. We'll go ahead and use our spindle roughing gouge. You can see this doesn't really take a lot of time to just rough this down to round really quickly. I feel I'm really close. Just take a little bit out of the center here. And we've got a nice dowel. This next step is where I run into a change from what I used to do. I generally, when I'm doing something thin, work from the tailstock end and work my way to the headstock end. But now I've kind of rethought things a little bit, and I work on the side of the drive center. And what that does is it gives me a little bit more stability. And when I'm using a beading tool to cut grooves, it helps it so it doesn't chip out as easily. So generally I'll do the head of the honey dipper first, and then I'll go back to my general rule and work from the tailstock back down to the headstock. And it works pretty well. So I'll get out my spindle roughing gouge here. And we'll just kind of do some pre-shaping of the head of this honey dipper. I'll just kind of round that over just a little bit. And really that's kind of all I need to do. I'll just remove some waste material here on the end so that I don't have any point sitting in the end of my honey dipper. And that's pretty good. We don't have to be real careful here because we're going to do a lot of shaping with the next tool that we bring in. So this is the next tool that I wanted to show you, and it's a beading tool. You can see it's got a flute on one side and then kind of a flat surface on the top, and you use this one flute down, which gives you kind of that semicircle to plunge into the piece of wood. And what you'll do is you'll keep that handle down and just plunge it into the piece of wood and rock it back and forth. And what it does is it makes it so that you're not contacting the wood all at the same time, so that you don't have the whole surface area of that circle on the wood, and it helps prevent a lot of vibrations when you do it this way. Okay. Now you can do a series of beads across the top of your honey dipper, and that works fine, but I like to put some grooves in between them now. And what that does is it just holds a little bit more honey so that you have a little bit more to drizzle out every time. And so I'll use a narrow parting tool and just go right next to that bead and go in a way. Sometimes I'm probably about 3/8 is all that's left here. I don't want to go too thin because then I won't have anything to drive the rest of my piece as I turn it. It could snap off if I go too thin, is what I'm saying. Now I'll go back with the beading tool and we'll do another bead. We'll just make sure that this one's just a little bit larger than the last so that we kind of have a nice rounded shape as we go through. Then we'll just come in with the parting tool and put another groove. And what I like to do is a peeling cut a lot of times, so I'll keep the handle low, put the parting tool on, and then just raise the handle until I get down to where the center of it down in the bottom of the groove is the same as the one next to it. So I try and eyeball that so that it's really, really close to the one next to it. So it looks like it goes all the way through, and these beads are sitting on top of a dowel. One thing to remember as you're doing this is if you get any like high-pitched squeals or anything like that, you're probably getting enough vibration that you're getting chipping on the end of your beads here. You want these to be as smooth as possible, so you don't have to do a lot of sanding later, because if you have to sand, you're going to ruin that round profile that you just made. So watch out for that. We'll go ahead and put one more groove in here and put it down to the same depth as we did before. So it looks like a dowel going through the center again. And then we'll bring that beading tool back. Form one more bead here. So we'll rock it back and forth, and we'll try and make this one about the same diameter as the one on the very far left side. So we've got this nice curve going across all these beads. Nice honey dipper shape. And then basically I'll bring in my parting tool just to take down a little bit here on the side and make sure I've got a really nice clean edge on the side of that bead. And then I can stop the lathe and just kind of feel and look over everything just to make sure that I don't have too much chipping or anything like that, nothing that I can't sand out, because I can do some work with the tools right now if I need to take the diameter down just a little bit farther and clean everything up. Like I said, I generally like to work from the tailstock end towards the headstock end. What that does is it eliminates some more vibrations as I get thin, and I still have some wood to drive the piece with as I get down to the other side. So we're going to just take our 3/8 spindle gouge here and start forming a little ball on the end. And I used to make a little handle here, and that's fine too. You can do that. But the little ball on the end I learned was kind of the way that the honey dipper works. It's a little ball you can put in the palm of your hand and use the shaft of the honey dipper to rotate the honey dipper as you dip it into the honey. And as you rotate the honey dipper, it keeps the honey in place. And I never knew that before. I was like, oh, cool, physics. So what's cool about that is when you stop rotating the honey dipper, then the honey has the chance to drip off of the honey dipper. It drizzles onto your toast or whatever you're going to put it on. Pretty cool. So we're just going to continue to shape this ball and bring it down and prepare it for our shaft that we're going to make here that goes over to the other side of our honey dipper. And I have all this material in the middle to remove, and I don't want to take a lot of time in it. I could use my 3/8 spindle gouge, but I'm just going to bring out that spindle roughing gouge again, because while it's thicker, I still can use this tool without getting too much vibration, and it removes a lot of material fast. So it makes it so that it just saves me a lot of time as I'm doing this. So I'll get it down to where I I think it's not going to vibrate too much. Then I can go back to the next tool. I'm starting to hear a little bit of a high-pitched squeal, and that means that the wood is vibrating, and I don't want too much of that. So I'm going to switch tools. This is a smaller tool. It's a 3/8 spindle gouge, and I can just kind of work my way down. And when you're turning something thin, I always tell people you do it like a 1/4 inch at a time. So you'll really just start in one area and work it down to where it's thin, and then just move to the next. We'll just kind of bring this down small, and it's starting to vibrate, so I'm going to use my hand for support. And you might feel nervous about this, but it's a round piece of wood, and as long as you don't have any sharp edges on it, you should be able to support that really well. And you just want to put enough pressure on it that you can use your tool so that it's not vibrating, but you don't want to put too much pressure on the wood because that's a piece of wood spinning at 2,500 RPM, and friction does work, and you'll notice heat building up on your hand. So if it's getting hot, you're holding it too much. You just need to make lighter cuts. But if it's not getting hot, then you're okay. And you can see that I'm supporting my tool with my thumb to make sure that I'm supported on the tool rest. And it helps me keep a measure of control as I come across this piece of wood. And you'll want to work this down to where it's, somewhere in the neighborhood of a 1/4 inch or less, maybe even 3/16, something like that, to give you a nice thin shaft on your honey dipper. Now, there are a couple of different methods for supporting the wood with your hand, and this is just one to do it on top like this. A lot of people like to wrap their hand underneath and support with their fingers from underneath, but you kind of have to be able to wrap your hand around the tool rest and still be able to support the tool with your thumb. And this tool rest wasn't really conducive to that, so I'm using it overhand. And you see, as I get closer to the headstock, I want to keep my fingers away from that spur drive center, and so I'm just using kind of just 1 or 2 fingers to support that wood. As I get closer to the headstock here, I don't need to do that anymore. I've got enough support from the side that I'm not getting a lot of vibration until I go out across the center again, and I'll get vibration, so I bring my hand up to support the wood again. The last thing I want to do is just make a little bit of clearance so that I can sand the end of this honey dipper. So I'll bring my narrow parting tool up, and I'll just kind of clean up this edge and remove some waste material on the end. And I usually leave a little bit of a step on the end that I can sand off. That way I don't have any tear out in the end of my honey dipper when I'm all done. Okay, now that the turning's done, we can get to sanding. As I'm sanding, I'll generally start with a 120 or 180 grit, and those grits are a little bit too rough for the beads on the end of our honey dipper. I don't want to make any flat spots or anything like that, or ruin the shape that I've put into it. And you'll notice that as I come across the center of this, I have to support it with my fingers a little bit, and that's just, you want to put opposite pressure on it so that you don't bend that shaft too far. You don't want your honey dipper that you've just worked so hard on to snap in half. I can do the ball here and work my way through the grits. And generally I won't touch the beads on the end until I get to about a 320 grit. So we'll work our way through the grits. This is a 180. And then we'll move to a 220 grit. Then we'll do a 320 grit, and at that point I can go ahead and sand these beads on the end. I'll just kind of come from one side, make sure I don't flatten anything out, and come from the other side, sand those, and then I'll fold it in half and kind of work down into those grooves so I can do a little bit of sanding in the interior. Okay, then we'll do a 400. And since maple polishes up so nice, I'll use a 600 grit. Go all the way to that. Okay, now we can put some finish on our honey dipper. And the thing is, you don't have to put a finish at all on a honey dipper. You can use just raw bare wood because honey is naturally antibacterial. I just think it makes them look and feel nice, and it's not going to hurt anything. So I use my finish that's walnut oil and some natural waxes like beeswax and carnauba wax. And I just spread that on and put some on the edge of the towel and just work it down into those grooves. And then we've got a nice food safe finish on it. Now before I part this off, I'm going to work this wood down just a little bit smaller so I have less to sand. So I'm going to bring in my skew chisel on this end. And we'll just work that down to where it's a really nice, smooth, fine point. And then on the other end, we'll take the parting tool and we'll go ahead and part down to where that's really close, something like 1/8 of an inch away. And then I can come in with a handsaw. Then just pull a couple of times and really that'll come right off of there. And I have an end that's ready to sand. To sand the ends, I've got this holder that'll take a 2-inch disc that I pop into the lathe. And I'll use about an 80 grit to start because I have a lot more material to remove on the ends of our honey dipper. So I've got this little nub on the ends and I just want to remove that. We'll turn on the lathe and make sure that we slow it way down. I'm something like 800 RPM. And on this one, I want to keep it round, so I want to keep it moving as I shape the end. That's pretty good for that grit. And then on this end, I've got kind of a lot of material to remove because I left that little step, but it helps me so I get a perfectly smooth end. And we'll just move it across and keep it moving until I remove that little step, and then we can move on to the next grits. So as I move through the grits here, I found that I can round and shape the end of this ball pretty well until I get to about 180 grit. And when I get to the 180 grit, it doesn't really start rounding it out. It just keeps making flat spots in it. So after the 180 grit, I have to switch over and hand sand the rest of it, which really doesn't take that long because you don't have really deep scratches put into it anymore. So we'll switch over and do some hand sanding. I do this on both ends just for convenience. But you'll see here on my 320 grit, I'll just leave it on the pad and just kind of round that over. Then we'll dab a little bit of finish on the ends and our honey dipper is complete.
All right, so here we have our new and improved honey dipper. It's a bit longer and it's a bit more functional, and I hope the instruction helped you so that you could make one of these. Speaking of instruction, I wanted to let you know that I've been invited as a demonstrator for the Woodturners Worldwide Online Symposium, and that's coming up at the end of the month here in 2023, the end of February. I'm super excited about this event because I get to participate as a demonstrator with some of my wood turning heroes. Some of the names you might recognize, like Mike Mahoney, Glenn Lucas, Richard Finley, Barbara Dill, Carl Jacobson. What's cool about this event is that you get to watch over 40 demonstrations and you get to have question and answer sessions with the demonstrator. And if you can't catch them all in that weekend, which you probably won't be able to do, then you can go back and watch them for 30 days after the event. So it's coming up here real soon at the end of February. It's the 24th through the 26th. If you'd like to register for this event, I'm going to put a link in the description that'll take you to the event website. And I'm going to save you some money. If you use my coupon code JASON at checkout, you'll save $10 on your registration. Thank you for being here today and making a honey dipper with me, and we'll see you soon.